So I'll be frank, when I said in the last video that 2020 was shaping up to be a great year, I didn't expect another game to be delayed, but I kind of might have jinxed Dying Light 2. Sorry guys, my bad. This delay highlights something about 2020's video game lineup that's been bubbling since the start of this delay-pocalypse, and that is a feeling of uncertainty about what was shaping up to be a killer year. I've already had some concerns about a handful of 2020's major titles, and today I would like to highlight 5 games that I'm a little bit worried about, in order from the games causing the least concern to a game that I just don't have any hope for. Don't get me wrong, I want each of these games to succeed because I want to be one of the millions that buys, plays, and loves all of them. Based on what we've seen so far though, it's hard for me to see all 5 of these games living up to their hype. I want to stress before I show you any gameplay of game number 1 that I am not super concerned about this game. In fact, I'm incredibly excited for it. If I was going to bet money on one game taking 2020's Game of the Year crown, it's this one. I do, however, have a few things that I worry might miss the mark. This game is one that I've gone into some detail on before, The Last of Us Part 2. Hold on, before you say anything, hear me out because these are concerns coming from a point of love and respect. This game is telling an inverse of the first game's story, focusing entirely on revenge and losing yourself in that vengeance. Thematically speaking, many of the little worries that I have tie into this idea of getting blinded by retribution, and I love that. From what we've seen so far though, some of the key issues that I had with the first game are not only not being addressed, Naughty Dog is in fact doubling down on them. Story sections and gameplay sections sound like they're being split apart even more sometimes. The 2 demos that have been shown off thus far were a lengthy story demo and a lengthy combat demo, with very little room where these 2 sides cross over. I would have personally liked to see more of a melding between these 2 elements, rather than dumping some fantastic story into one chapter and then what looks to be even better gameplay in another chapter. This sort of disconnect can lead to a game feeling longer than it actually is as the game starts to get lost in itself, and I don't feel like this is the right call to address some of the pacing issues that I've felt the first game had. Based on the fact that they've shown off almost 5 hours of the game between the 2 demos, I can't help but think that Part 2's length is also ballooning, and it might be ballooning a bit too far. I've seen fantastic and promising games taken down a notch by poor pacing decisions, and while I don't think this game will be ruined by any stretch, it might not live up to being the best game that it could if my fears are correct. Perhaps more than any of the other issues put together, I'm afraid that The Last of Us Part 2 is going to be too brutal, too violent, too visceral for many people to comfortably handle. The first game was sold partly on that brutality, showing what becomes of good people in an apocalypse and what Joel would do to protect Ellie. Make no mistake, Joel is not a good man, not anymore. Throughout the first game, we learn that he's been on both sides of ambush schemes, and every time he's one step ahead of a group of thugs, you can only wonder what he'd done on the other side of those same fights in the past to get this experienced. And in spite of how brutal Part 1 can be, Part 2 somehow tackles some much more violent ground. That's partly due to the absolutely insane visual quality, of course, but also due to the way that Naughty Dog is going about the story. We've seen a lengthy, uncomfortable scene where a character is being hung in real time. We've seen flesh bend and puncture as a cult-like figure pushes a knife into somebody's stomach. We've seen Ellie break off arrows that were shot into her arm as an actual in-game mechanic. Most players at some point in this game will probably have to murder a dog. Even if Naughty Dog says it's never required, let's face it, most players will end up having to do so due to a lack of planning or skill or just bad luck. This game is very much pushing the boundaries, and I can't help but think it's going to push too far for some. Will any of this brutality bother me to the point of turning the game off? No, probably not, but I'm not thinking just about myself when I express these concerns. I'm thinking about the almost 20 million people that have played the first game, the tens of millions that are looking forward to Part 2, many of whom may not have any idea just how visceral an experience they're in for. Is this violence, this brutality the point? Yes, absolutely. Does that make it the right call though? I don't think so. If anything, this could all lean more towards glorifying the violence, which is seemingly the polar opposite of what Naughty Dog is trying to convey. Either way, there are tons of adjustments and improvements that we're already seeing in Part 2 that make me excited for it as a game, even if I do have some concerns about the themes that it tackles. The enhanced crafting system, for example, looks amazing. The stealth gameplay should be ramped up even more with the presence of those search and attack dogs, and each area shown off looks to have even more by way of combat options. Until relatively recently, I enjoyed The Last of Us Part 1 more as a game than I did as a narrative, so this is all fantastic for me. I just really hope that, like Ellie, Naughty Dog doesn't lose itself too much trying to prove a point or justify a theme. Jumping from one PlayStation game to another, sometime this summer, Sucker Punch will launch its first game in half a decade, Ghost of Tsushima. I don't know about you, but I'm a big fan of Sucker Punch. Sly Cooper and the PS3 Infamous games are some of my favorites, and I even enjoyed their first game, Rocket Robot on Wheels, which pretty much none of you have even heard of. With that said, the studio hasn't really had a great console generation. Their first game on PS4, Infamous Second Son, was fine, but suffered from a weaker plot and toned back game mechanics to make up for the introduction of additional superpowers. Looking back, it's pretty clear that Second Son was rushed out the door to meet the growing demand for, well, anything on the PS4. That launch window was pretty rough. The rumor I recall at the time was that behind the scenes, Second Son's release date was pushed up to the PS4's launch by a full year because the Order 1886 needed way more time. Way to kill two games at once, Sony. Now, sure, Second Son's behind-the-scenes date was moved back to March 2014 eventually, but that didn't help it all that much. I'm really glad that Ghost of Tsushima isn't getting that same treatment. In fact, it's getting the opposite. According to Kotaku's Jason Schreier, it was originally lined up closer to a May release date before The Last of Us's delay bumped it back even further. Clearly, Sucker Punch had all the time in the world with this one, and they're still one of the best in the industry at dropping jaws with their visuals. Actually, if you look online, Tsushima's graphics dominate the conversation surrounding this game. Very few people are talking about, the important part, the gameplay. See, I remember back to the days when we didn't know what this game was, when we were just hearing rumblings that the vertical slice of Sucker Punch's new game wasn't impressing the higher-up executives at PlayStation. And recalling that memory makes me think that this game didn't have 5 years of proper development after Infamous Second Son and First Light were finished, but that it had a couple years of development struggles right around the 2014 layoffs at the studio. And when Ghost of Tsushima was finally revealed in late 2017, what we got to see was a beautiful setting covering up what looks to be every third-person combat system of the last decade. What's more, to me, it really lacked a punch. What were meant to be deliberate samurai cuts that can incapacitate an enemy in one single swing just looked bland compared to Sucker Punch's flashy history. Combat looks to have improved a bit since then from the small chunks of gameplay that we've been allowed to see, but I really can't say that this game looks to do anything new. I'm really hoping I'm wrong, and that Tsushima blows my lowered expectations out of the water, because I do want to see Sucker Punch and Ghost of Tsushima succeed. Like everybody else, I adore the setting, but if this setting is just the backdrop for yet another Ubisoft-styled open-world game, I don't know. I'd expect more than a decade-old trend from a big-budget 2020 video game. If nothing else, at worst we've finally got our Assassin's Creed Samurai game, I suppose. The third game that I'm worried about in 2020, and again, hear me out before you yell at me, is Final Fantasy VII. I know, I just said in my 7 games you should be excited about video that I'm looking forward to 7's remake. But specifically the part that worries me about this game is that it's only part 1 of a 2 or maybe even 3-part series. This first part has been in development for at least 5 years, is already spread across 2 discs, and is coming out during the transition between 2 console generations. Part 2 only started proper development in late 2019, and earlier that year at E3 we found out that they didn't even know what Part 2 was going to entail. No matter how you cut it, that is kind of a problem. I know Square's gone on record saying that the remaining parts wouldn't take nearly as long to make as the 5+ years to get the basics and Midgard down, but we've still got the vast majority of Final Fantasy VII left to cover. Moreover, things are inevitably going to change as the team receives feedback from players and critics on this first part. What if mechanics change by the time that Part 2 hits the PS5 in like 2 to 5 years? Better yet, how is the supposed save data transfer going to work between Parts 1 and 2 between 2 generations of consoles? Will Part 1's level cap be absurdly low to ensure that you can't power level for the next game and break it immediately? Or will there be no save data transferring at all, and instead you'll get a Chocobo skin and some money for having a Final Fantasy VII Part 1 save? I don't have many doubts about this first game right now, but how it's going to connect to the larger Final Fantasy VII Remake project? Yeah, I don't have high hopes. Originally, I was going to finish the fight with this next one, but it's kind of been back and forth between this one and the final game on today's list. Finally, I get to move away from Sony games in this video and talk about Halo Infinite. Where the 2000-aughts were in many ways the decade of Halo, the 2010s have not been good to Master Chief. After Bungie and Microsoft finalized their split with Halo Reach's 2010 release, secondary developer 343 took the reins on Microsoft's only important franchise. Yes, I just said that, and yes, I like Gears, but let's be real here. Since the developer change, we've had a major fanbase schism because 343 initially tried to change Reach to make it more like quote-unquote real Halo, only for them to then incorporate Reach's improvements into Halo 4. We've had a remake of Halo 1, which was, cool, I guess. And then we had all the Xbox One stuff, which has been one of the worst handled failures of the entire generation, a series of massive debacles that has somehow flown under the radar. The Master Chief Collection, as of this week, still doesn't work, and no, I'm not talking about the messy PC release from just a few months back. I'm talking about the Xbox One game that released over 5 years ago and still has major issues. My buddies and I spent over an hour just a few days ago trying to play online together, but because of persistent, unexplained issues, one of us would always disconnect. You can look at a dozen different forums, both official and unofficial, over the last half-decade and see this exact issue playing out. Oh, but don't worry, if you go to those forums, buried on page 49, in between two people arguing about whether Chief and Cortana could have children together, a few thousand players have worked out a jury-rigged fix for these connection problems, a fix that works like 20% of the time, and all the while 343 has not said jack shit. Don't worry though, this fix is super simple, it'll take you no time at all. Each of you just have to reset all of your consoles, then load into an offline single-player campaign game individually, but make sure that all of your game settings are identical between each player. Then one of you has to leave and invite the others one by one to the lobby, but do so through the Xbox menu, not through Halo itself. And then you hold A and press right on the D-pad for every time the countdown timer clicks, and then you spin around twice and fucking pray to Phil Spencer that your goddamn video game works properly. You know what just sort of worked on the Xbox 360? Halo. You know what works on Xbox One backwards compatibility? Halo. I can load the exact same Halo games, but through my Xbox 360 menu instead, and they work perfectly. And I'm not even gonna take the time to talk about Halo 5, because that game's development was apparently a whole novel's worth of nightmares. Plot changes, writers leaving, and creative shifts midway through development, deceptive marketing, possibly irreparable damage to the series, the whole 9 yards. Just last year, midway through development yet again, Halo Infinite's creative director left 343, and the following day, not even 24 hours later, cosmetic microtransactions and a live service of some sort were confirmed for this game's late 2020 launch. And by the way, that launch is not only on the new Xbox Series X console, but also PC where Halo hasn't been working, and Xbox One where Halo hasn't been working. To rephrase those numbers, that's 3 platforms for one game that's been MIA for 5 years from a developer who's seemingly going through some late-stage restructures for the second time in a row. I know the official explanation for this game having spent so long in the oven is that they considered making another game in between 5 and Infinite, but didn't want to put in less than 100% effort, and that's great if so. If you expect me to believe that Infinite isn't going to run into issues with that 100% effort when it's spread across 3 platforms though, when there's no indication that this game won't run into the very same issues that the last few games have, yeah, no, I'm not gonna buy that, sorry. Which brings me to the last game, another one that I can't say I'm gonna buy, a game that's been marred with at least as many development issues as Halo Infinite, and that is Marvel's Avengers. Now delayed to a September release date, I'm sorry, I don't see anything promising in this game. Another game whose issues were well documented well before its reveal, there was almost an expectation at points that this crossover project between Eidos and Crystal Dynamics had quietly been cancelled. And then it was revealed at E3 2019 as a bland action game where you either fly around as Iron Man in scripted sequences or run around as the other Avengers in tightly controlled corridors and punch things. There seems to be no weight to any of the gameplay we've seen so far besides Iron Man. It's just ultra basic third-person beat-em-up combat. And to paraphrase my buddy Mini-Me, who played the Avengers demo at a trade show, even Iron Man has some lame controls that don't really live up to the visuals during his sections of the game. Of course, this is the very first level. It's naturally gonna be basic, right? The problem comes when that's what was shown off, proudly at that, as a way to excite you into purchasing the game. If that's the best that they have to show, I'm sorry, this game will not be very good. And I think they know that because of the almost 15 minutes that were dedicated to the Avengers at Square's E3 show last year, more time was spent talking about how there won't be loot boxes than showing actual gameplay. A good chunk of this reveal was showing off the all-star cast of voice actors performing as the Avengers. You know, Nolan North, Troy Baker, Travis Willingham, Laura Bailey, and that guy. This presentation was the definition of style over substance, and that's because as E3 progressed and we saw actual gameplay of the Avengers, it wasn't worth talking about. The game's creative director expressed after the show that they expected backlash. That is not a good sign. If this was being positioned in a, yeah, this is a 7 out of 10 kind of game sort of way, where expectations weren't being intentionally raised, and where the production value isn't just acting as a cover for the actual game, that would be fine. But as a massive budget all-star video game, I would be shocked if it doesn't disappoint. And even though the 6-month delay will hopefully only help these Avengers become more than a B-movie knockoff, as Kotaku's Jason Schreier noted recently, Crystal Dynamics is known for its crunch time practices, offering raffle tickets to people that stay overtime. That's right, folks, for only 10 overtime raffle tickets, you can redeem for 1 free coffee! With all that said though, I don't wish for the Avengers or any of these games to underdeliver. I want to see them end up as the best games they can possibly be. I just have concerns about each that I've gotten a little bit lost in the hype cycle. Here's hoping that I'm wrong about each of these games, and maybe near the end of the year I'll revisit the topic to see if I sadly got any of these right. What about you? Do you have any games coming out this year that are worrying you? Let me know down in the comments below. After all, I'm sure some of my most anticipated games are ones that at least some of you are fearing. As always, thank you very much for watching, subscribing, sharing, and supporting, and until next time, stay golden. This video was made possible in part thanks to the generous support of these Patreon backers. If you'd like to see your name on this list, you can do so by supporting the channel at patreon.com/thegoldenbolt. Thank you.